Let's look at another kind of equation. Equations that contain an absolute value. If we just think about absolute value for a moment, if you're taking the absolute value, remember what the idea of absolute value is, and absolute value is indicated to us with those vertical bars around a quantity. Remember the idea of absolute value? Absolute value is the distance that a number is from 0 on the number line. So the absolute value of 5 is 5 because 5 is 5 units away from 0. But also the absolute value of negative 5 is 5 because negative 5 is 5 units away from 0. So if we're taking the absolute value of some quantity, so there's some quantity here on the dotted line. We can't see it. It's hiding from us right now. But if the absolute value of that quantity is 2, don't we know that the quantity in there has to either be 2 or negative 2? Because aren't those the only two numbers that have an absolute value of 2, the numbers 2 and negative 2? So whatever that quantity is, I know whatever's hiding there on the dotted line, well, it's on the dotted line, it's invisible to us. So whatever is invisible here has to be 2 or negative 2. So if that quantity was x plus 9, then wouldn't that quantity x plus 9 have to equal 2 or negative 2? If that quantity is going to have an absolute value of 2, the only way that can happen is that quantity has to be 2 or that quantity has to be negative 2. So if we have an absolute value equation that says the absolute value of x plus 9 equals 2, we can conclude that x plus 9 has to equal 2 or x plus 9 has to equal negative 2. And that creates two equations minus the absolute value sign, which we can now solve. And they're just nice linear equations in one variable. We would subtract 9 from both sides, which in this instance would give us x equals negative 7. When we subtract 9 from both sides of this equation, we get x equals negative 11. And when we substitute either of those values into the original equation, it will make the statement true. Let's try that. If we let x be negative 7, negative 7 plus 9 is 2. Absolute value of 2 is 2. If we let x be negative 11, negative 11 plus 9 is negative 2, but the absolute value of negative 2 is 2. And this gives us a technique that we can use to solve absolute value equations. We can isolate the absolute value sign on one side of the equation and isolate a constant on the other side, and then we can draw the conclusion just as we did here, which will create two new equations for us. We can solve those equations, and we will have the solutions for the original absolute value equation.